They called it a sacred tradition, but everyone in Frost Hollow knew the truth. Traditions were meant to protect a community. This one only decided who would be left behind. Before sunrise, the village square stood wrapped in fresh snow beneath a pale winter sky. Doors remained shut. Market stalls stood empty. Even the church bell that usually welcomed the morning never rang. Silence spread across the village like another layer of frost, broken only by the slow creak of an old wooden wagon waiting beside the ancient moon tree. Evelyn Carter stepped from her tiny cottage carrying nothing except a worn brown satchel that held a change of clothes and a faded family photograph. She had packed it herself the night before. No one had asked her to. Deep inside, she had known this day was coming long before anyone found the courage to speak it aloud. People watched through cracked curtains as she crossed the snow-covered path. Some quietly lowered their eyes. Others pretended to busy themselves with morning chores. A few children looked ready to wave before anxious parents gently pulled them back inside. Evelyn did not blame them. Fear had lived in Frost Hollow longer than she had. Elder Miriam waited beneath the moon tree with the other village elders. The old woman's face carried neither pride nor relief. Only the quiet exhaustion of someone forced to repeat a decision she no longer believed was right. "The Royal Council has renewed its request," she said softly. "Black Thorn Castle has asked for another offering." No one spoke Evelyn's name. They did not have to. She had always been the easiest choice. A rejected Omega whose wolf had never awakened. A young woman without a bond, without status, and without anyone powerful enough to argue for her. For years, she had listened as whispers followed her through every street. Some pitied her. Others feared she carried bad fortune. Eventually, even kindness became uncomfortable because it always sounded temporary. Elder Miriam stepped closer and pressed a small silver moon pendant into Evelyn's hand. "Your mother wore this when she was your age," she whispered. Surprise crossed Evelyn's face. "I thought it was lost." "Some things are hidden," the old woman replied quietly. "Others are kept until the right moment." Before Evelyn could ask another question, one of the council guards cleared his throat impatiently. "We have a long journey ahead." She climbed into the wagon without resistance. The worn wooden seat groaned beneath her weight as the horses began pulling them toward the northern mountains. Snow-covered forests slowly swallowed the village behind them until Frost Hollow disappeared completely. For several miles, neither Evelyn nor Elder Miriam spoke. The old woman seemed troubled by thoughts she could not bring herself to share. Finally, as towering black pines closed around the narrow mountain road, she broke the silence. "Everything you have heard about the cursed Alpha King." She paused, searching for the right words. "Not every story survives without changing." Evelyn looked out across the endless forest. "Then why does everyone believe them?" Elder Miriam gave a weary smile. "Because fear travels faster than truth." The wagon continued climbing until Black Thorn Castle appeared beyond the cliffs, its dark towers rising through silver mist like something carved from the mountain itself. It looked ancient rather than cruel, lonely rather than terrifying. Yet the moment the horses reached the enormous iron gates, they stopped so suddenly that the wagon barely rocked. They refused to take another step. The guards tugged gently on the reins, but the animals stood perfectly still, their ears lifted toward the castle as if listening to a voice no human could hear. Then the gates opened without a single guard touching them. No chains rattled. No commands echoed from the walls. They simply parted in complete silence. A cold breeze drifted across the courtyard carrying the scent of cedar instead of decay. As Evelyn stepped down from the wagon, something dark slipped across the ancient stone beneath her boots. It moved like living smoke, flowing past every guard, every elder, and every servant waiting near the entrance. It ignored them all. Then, with quiet certainty, it circled Evelyn's feet before becoming perfectly still. None of the guards seemed to notice. But somewhere, high above, hidden behind the tallest castle window, a lonely king slowly lifted his head as though he had just felt something impossible awaken after 15 years of silence. The living shadow disappeared so quietly that Evelyn almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Yet the strange warmth lingering around her ankles refused to fade. She looked down at the ancient stone one last time before lifting her eyes toward the towering castle. Every window reflected the pale winter sky. Every wall seemed impossibly still, as though Black Thorn Castle had spent years waiting for someone it could no longer remember by name. A graceful woman descended the broad staircase leading from the main entrance. She wore a dark blue gown trimmed with silver thread, her long silver hair neatly braided behind her back. There was elegance in the way she carried herself, but also weariness, the kind that settled into a person's eyes after carrying hope for far too long. She stopped before Evelyn and offered a respectful bow. "Welcome to Black Thorn Castle. I am Helena." Her voice was calm and warm enough to soften the cold morning air. "His Majesty asked that you be treated with every courtesy our home can offer." Home. The word caught Evelyn off guard. No one had described this place as a home. Elder Miriam stepped forward beside the wagon. "The offering has been delivered according to the decree issued by the Royal Council." Helena's gentle expression changed almost imperceptibly. "The decree came from the council," she replied. "It did not come from our king." The words hung in the air. One of the guards shifted uneasily, but said nothing. Evelyn glanced from Helena to Elder Miriam, sensing there were truths neither woman could safely speak aloud. At last Elder Miriam reached into her sleeve and squeezed Evelyn's hand one final time. "Listen more than you fear," she whispered. "Sometimes the oldest stories are the least complete." Then she turned away before Evelyn could answer. The wagon rolled back through the gates, disappearing down the mountain road until only silence remained. Helena waited patiently. "Come," she said with a faint smile. "You have traveled far." The entrance hall was nothing like Evelyn expected. Instead of darkness and ruin, warm candlelight stretched across polished stone floors. The air carried the comforting scent of cedar wood, fresh bread, and burning pine. Servants crossed the hall with baskets of fruit, folded blankets, and steaming kettles of tea. They greeted Helena with quiet smiles before returning to their work. No one looked frightened. No one rushed. It felt less like a cursed fortress than a household determined to preserve ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances. As they walked deeper into the castle, Evelyn noticed portraits lining the walls. Every generation of Alpha Kings had been painted beneath the same silver moon crest. The earlier portraits showed families, celebrations, and harvest festivals. The final portrait stood alone. A young king with silver hair and thoughtful eyes gazed toward distant mountains instead of the artist. There was no queen beside him, no royal court, only winter. Evelyn stopped walking. "Is that him?" Helena followed her gaze. It was painted shortly before the curse became part of every story told about this castle. Evelyn studied the face in silence. There was sadness there, but no cruelty. "He does not look dangerous," Helena answered with a quiet sadness of her own. The most dangerous thing that ever happened to Damien Ashford was that people stopped looking long enough to see who he truly was. Before Evelyn could ask another question, faint footsteps echoed above them. Somewhere on the upper floor, a little girl laughed before racing across the hallway. A man's gentle voice followed. "Slow down, Lily. You will outrun breakfast." The child giggled even louder. Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Children live here?" Helena smiled. Several families refused to leave when the kingdom abandoned its king. That simple answer unsettled Evelyn more than any frightening story she had ever heard. If families trusted the man living inside these walls, then what else had the outside world misunderstood? Helena led her toward a grand staircase that spiraled into the eastern tower. The higher they climbed, the quieter the castle became. Warm conversations faded behind them until only the sound of their footsteps remained. At the end of a long corridor stood two enormous black doors carved with wolves beneath a full moon. Every servant stopped well before reaching them. None crossed the final stretch of hallway. Helena lowered her voice. "Everything changes beyond these doors." Evelyn drew a slow breath. "Because of the curse?" Helena looked at the carved wolves before answering. "Because that is where everyone stops believing what they can see and starts believing what they have been told." Before another word could be spoken, the heavy doors slowly opened by themselves. Moonlight poured into the corridor. A lone figure stood before the towering windows with his back to them, unmoving beneath a sky of drifting snow. Without turning around, he spoke in a low, steady voice that carried years of quiet solitude. "You should not have brought another innocent into this place." At that exact moment, a ribbon of living darkness slipped from the shadows beside the king. It drifted toward him as it always had for 15 long years. Then, for the first time, It passed him without stopping and glided silently across the floor until it curled itself around Evelyn's feet instead. The silence inside the chamber seemed to deepen as the living darkness settled around Evelyn's feet. For the first time in 15 years, it had crossed the room without lingering beside the king. Damien Ashford slowly turned away from the towering windows, his silver eyes fixed not on the young woman standing before him, but on the ancient presence that had abandoned him without hesitation. He did not look offended. He looked as though the impossible had finally happened after years of expecting nothing at all. Helena remained perfectly still near the doorway. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. It has never done that. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the shadow curling gently around her boots. Every story she had heard described the curse as hungry, cruel, and merciless. Yet nothing about it felt threatening. It moved with remarkable patience, almost like a faithful animal waiting for permission rather than demanding obedience. Damien took one measured step closer. "Does it frighten you?" he asked quietly. Evelyn searched for fear inside herself and found only curiosity. She slowly shook her head. No. Something softened in Damien's expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest his face had come to peace in years. "Everyone else was afraid before they ever crossed this room," he said. "Some never looked at me. They only looked at the shadow." Evelyn met his eyes without hesitation. Maybe they arrived believing the story instead of looking for the truth. The words lingered between them. Damien studied her carefully, as though trying to understand why someone who had every reason to fear him simply did not. Then the living darkness rose from the floor and drifted toward Evelyn's hand. It paused inches away, waiting. She hesitated only a moment before reaching out with one finger. The instant her skin brushed the edge of the shadow, warmth spread gently through her hand instead of cold. A forgotten memory surfaced without warning. She was 7 years old again, kneeling beside a frightened fawn caught beneath broken branches after a storm. Everyone had warned her to stay away, convinced the animal would panic. Instead, the trembling creature had quietly rested its head against her shoulder until help arrived. Another memory followed. An injured hawk that had allowed only Evelyn to bandage its wing. A frightened horse that had calmed the moment she whispered into its ear. Moments she had dismissed as coincidence now gathered together like scattered pieces of the same forgotten picture. The shadow circled her wrist once before dissolving into countless silver sparks that vanished beneath her skin. A delicate crescent-shaped mark shimmered faintly against her wrist before fading almost as quickly as it had appeared. Helena drew a sharp breath. The mark. Damien's gaze never left Evelyn's hand. "Every offering before you grew weaker the moment the curse touched them," he said softly. "Some collapsed before sunset. Others begged to leave." He looked back into her eyes. "You look stronger." Evelyn realized he was right. The weight she had carried since entering the castle had quietly disappeared. Even her heartbeat felt calmer than it had that morning in Frost Hollow. Helena slowly found her voice. "Perhaps the council was wrong all along." Damien remained silent for a long moment before answering. "The council believes this is a curse because that is the only explanation they have ever accepted." His eyes drifted briefly toward the moonlight spilling across the floor. But curses do not wait patiently for 15 years, and they do not choose with such care. Before Evelyn could ask what he meant, the living darkness emerged again, gliding past her shoulder toward Damien. He closed his eyes instinctively, expecting its familiar presence to settle around him as it always had. Instead, it lingered beside him for only a heartbeat before quietly returning to Evelyn's side once more. Damien slowly opened his eyes. This time there was no disbelief left in them, only the quiet certainty that everything he had believed about his own fate had just begun to change. "Someone," he whispered almost to himself, "has spent a very long time calling the wrong thing a curse." Damien did not speak again until the last silver spark disappeared beneath Evelyn's skin. The chamber remained perfectly still, yet something inside the castle had unmistakably changed. It was subtle at first. A distant grandfather clock that had been silent for years chimed once somewhere deep within the eastern wing. Outside the towering windows, a flock of white birds lifted into the winter sky as though startled awake by an invisible signal. Helena looked from the king to Evelyn, unable to hide the hope slowly returning to her face. "There is something you need to see," she said at last. Damien gave a quiet nod. "Come with us." They left the moonlit chamber and followed a long corridor lined with tall, arched windows. As they walked, Evelyn began noticing details she had missed when she first entered the castle. Fresh flowers rested beneath every family portrait despite the middle of winter. Fireplaces burned warmly in every occupied room. Servants greeted Damien by name instead of title, and he answered every greeting with quiet familiarity. An elderly gardener carrying baskets of herbs paused to ask whether the king had remembered to eat breakfast. Damien smiled with embarrassed honesty. "I forgot again." The old man sighed before handing him a warm apple pastry from his basket. "Then forget a little less tomorrow." Evelyn could not help smiling. Nothing about these moments matched the terrifying ruler described in every story she had grown up hearing. Helena noticed her expression. "Fear rarely tells the whole story," she said softly. The people who remained here chose to trust the man they knew instead of the rumors carried beyond these walls. They eventually reached an ancient library hidden behind two carved oak doors. Shelves stretched upward toward a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations surrounding a silver moon. Thousands of books rested undisturbed beneath decades of quiet care, their leather bindings softened by age rather than neglect. Dust drifted lazily through narrow beams of afternoon light, giving the room the peaceful stillness of a place that had been waiting to be remembered. Damien walked directly toward a narrow shelf tucked into the darkest corner. Resting alone upon it was a simple, white leather book with no title engraved on its cover. "Every scholar sent by the Royal Council asked to read this book," he said. "None of them ever succeeded." Evelyn tilted her head. "Was it locked?" Helena answered with a thoughtful smile. "Not by any key they understood." Damien stepped back without another word. Evelyn reached out slowly until her fingertips brushed the worn leather cover. A soft click echoed through the library. One candle burst into flame. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, warm light flowed across the entire room as though the library itself had awakened from a long sleep. The white book opened on its own. Instead of faded ink, silver words slowly appeared across an otherwise empty page. "The curse remembers what fear chooses to erase." Evelyn quietly read the sentence aloud. The moment the final word left her lips, another page turned by itself. Tucked between the brittle parchment rested an old handwritten letter with one corner deliberately torn away. The surviving lines were barely readable. "The council must never learn. Lord Cedric insists the guardian. If the promise is remembered." The remaining sentences had been removed with careful precision. Helena's expression immediately changed. She gently closed the letter before Evelyn could search for the missing pages. "Someone wanted history forgotten," she said quietly. Damien rested his hand against the closed book, his voice carrying a sadness deeper than anger. "And someone else worked very hard to make sure the kingdom remembered only the curse." Before anyone moved, the white book opened one final time without being touched. New silver words slowly appeared across the empty page, brighter than before. "The one who remembers the promise must first uncover the lie." As the final sentence settled onto the parchment, the silver mark beneath Evelyn's wrist pulsed gently, and somewhere far below the castle, an ancient heartbeat answered in return. The steady heartbeat beneath the castle echoed only once before fading back into silence, but its rhythm lingered inside Evelyn long after the sound itself disappeared. She looked down at the silver mark hidden beneath her wrist, half expecting it to vanish as quickly as before. Instead, it remained faintly visible, like moonlight resting beneath clear water. Damien watched it in thoughtful silence before gently closing the white book and returning it to its place on the shelf. This time, the cover remained slightly open instead of sealing itself shut. "It has never stayed open," Helena whispered. "Not even once." Damien rested his fingertips against the worn leather for a brief moment. "Perhaps it no longer has a reason to remain closed." He turned toward Evelyn. "There is one more place I want you to see." They left the library and descended a narrow spiral staircase hidden behind one of the towering bookshelves. The stone walls grew older with every step, their carefully carved surfaces giving way to raw mountain rock shaped centuries before the castle itself had existed. The air became cooler, carrying the scent of rain and ancient cedar instead of burning fireplaces. No one spoke. Even Helena seemed to treat the silence with quiet respect. At the bottom of the staircase, an arched passage opened into a circular chamber carved entirely from pale gray stone. Sunlight filtered through a narrow opening high above, illuminating a single crystal sphere resting upon an unadorned pedestal at the center of the room. Unlike every treasure Evelyn had imagined finding beneath a royal castle, the crystal looked remarkably ordinary. It was slightly cloudy with age, its surface marked by tiny imperfections that reflected the light in soft silver fragments. Damien stopped several feet away. Every Alpha King has stood before this crystal. Evelyn looked at him. What does it do? A faint smile crossed his face, though sadness lingered behind it. It answers only one question. Which question? The one a person carries without realizing it. He nodded toward the pedestal. Go ahead. Evelyn stepped forward and gently rested her hand against the cool crystal. At first nothing happened. Then silver ripples slowly spread beneath the glass like moonlight drifting across still water. Instead of words, memories began unfolding before her eyes. She saw Damien as a much younger man helping villagers rebuild a wooden bridge after heavy spring floods. His sleeves were rolled above his elbows, his hands stained with mud as he laughed alongside ordinary workers who treated him like family rather than royalty. The vision shifted. He knelt beside an elderly woman repairing the roof of her cottage while refusing every attempt to thank him. Another memory appeared. A frightened little girl hid behind him during a violent thunderstorm, and Damien stayed beside her until the rain finally stopped. There were no grand speeches, no ceremonies, only quiet acts of kindness repeated again and again. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Every story she had ever heard about the cursed Alpha King crumbled beneath the weight of these simple moments. She slowly looked toward Damien. You never became the man they described. He gave a weary smile. Perhaps I never stopped being the man they chose to forget. Before she could answer, the crystal suddenly brightened once more. This time no memories appeared. Instead, a familiar silver crest slowly emerged inside the glass, identical to the mark beneath Evelyn's wrist. Helena inhaled sharply. The guardian's seal. At that exact moment, a calm, ancient voice drifted through the chamber itself, neither loud nor frightening, but impossible to ignore. The false keeper draws near. Damien's expression changed immediately, not with fear, but with recognition. He had heard those words before, or something very close to them. As they turned toward the tunnel leading back to the castle, distant footsteps echoed from somewhere above, followed by the muffled sound of the great entrance doors opening. Damien closed his eyes for only a heartbeat before quietly saying the name that had appeared inside the torn letter. Cedric. He has come sooner than I expected. Damien did not waste another moment. The calm in his voice remained, but his pace quickened as he led Evelyn and Helena back through the winding passages toward the upper halls of the castle. The ancient words still echoed inside Evelyn's thoughts. The false keeper draws near. She did not know exactly what they meant, yet every instinct told her they were connected to the missing letter, the forgotten promise, and the man whose name Damien had spoken with such quiet certainty. By the time they reached the Great Hall, the atmosphere throughout Black Thorn Castle had changed. Servants moved with composed urgency rather than panic. Guards quietly took their places beside the great entrance without drawing weapons. No one appeared frightened. They looked prepared, as though an expected storm had finally reached the castle gates after years on the horizon. A young messenger hurried across the marble floor before stopping respectfully before Damien. Your Majesty, he said, catching his breath, Lord Cedric Hawthorne requests an audience on behalf of the Royal Council. Damien gave a slow nod. Bring him in. The messenger bowed and disappeared. Helena quietly stepped beside Evelyn. Whatever happens, she whispered, watch carefully. Some people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are in control. The enormous oak doors slowly opened. Lord Cedric Hawthorne entered with measured confidence, accompanied by two council officials who remained several respectful steps behind him. He wore an elegant silver coat embroidered with the crest of the Royal Council, every detail perfectly arranged, every movement polished by years spent among nobles and scholars. His appearance inspired confidence. His smile suggested kindness. Yet the moment his pale gray eyes settled on Evelyn, the warmth beneath her wrist returned without warning. The silver mark pulsed once beneath her skin, calm but unmistakable. Cedric noticed the tiny movement of her hand before offering Damien a courteous bow. "Your Majesty," he said pleasantly. "I am relieved to see the journey has ended safely." Damien returned the greeting with equal courtesy. "Your concern is noted." Cedric allowed himself a faint smile before turning toward Evelyn. "Miss Carter, I hope the stories about this castle have proven less frightening than expected." There was nothing openly threatening in his voice, yet Evelyn sensed he was measuring every expression on her face. She answered honestly, "I have discovered that stories and truth are not always the same." For the briefest instant, Cedric's smile faltered before returning. An admirable conclusion. He slowly walked toward the center of the hall, where the ancient wolf crest had been carved into the marble centuries earlier. The council has spent many years searching for a way to free this kingdom from the curse. Damien folded his hands behind his back, or to control what it never understood. Cedric met his gaze without irritation. Understanding means little if people continue to suffer. His attention shifted back to Evelyn. "Tell me, since arriving here, have you experienced anything unusual?" Before Evelyn could answer, the living darkness quietly emerged from beneath the edge of the throne platform. It flowed across the polished floor with effortless grace, passing within inches of Damien without stopping. Every servant instinctively stepped back, not out of fear, but out of respect for something ancient. Cedric remained motionless. Only his eyes betrayed him. They followed the shadow with unmistakable anticipation. The darkness continued its silent journey until it reached Evelyn. Instead of circling her feet as before, it rose gently around her wrist where the silver mark rested hidden beneath her sleeve. The mark answered immediately, glowing softly through the fabric. Cedric drew a slow breath. His carefully practiced composure cracked for only a heartbeat. Wonder, envy, longing. They crossed his face so quickly that almost no one would have noticed. Almost no one except Evelyn. Very quietly, believing no one could hear him, he murmured, "After all these years, why her?" In that single unfinished question, Evelyn understood what the Guardian had meant. Cedric had never wanted to destroy the so-called curse. He had spent years believing that if it ever chose someone, it should have chosen him. Cedric's whispered question lingered in Evelyn's thoughts long after the silence returned. After all these years, why her? It was not the voice of a man who feared the curse. It was the voice of someone who had spent years waiting to be chosen by it. Damien seemed to recognize the same truth. His expression did not harden with anger. Instead, a quiet sadness settled over him, as though another piece of a forgotten history had finally fallen into place. "You were never searching for a way to end this," Damien said calmly. Cedric met his gaze without looking away. "I searched for a way to protect the kingdom, by claiming something that was never yours." Damien asked. Cedric's composed smile faded for the first time. If the Guardian had chosen someone willing to lead without hesitation, countless lives could have been spared. Helena stepped forward before the conversation could continue. Or perhaps countless lives suffered because too many people believed they deserved to carry a promise that had to be freely given. Cedric offered her a respectful glance, but his attention quickly returned to Evelyn. "Tell me honestly," he said, "what has it shown you?" Evelyn remembered the white book, the crystal, and the quiet memories of Damien helping ordinary people without asking for recognition. She slowly shook her head. "It has not shown me power." Cedric frowned. "Then what?" "It showed me kindness." The answer seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. Before anyone spoke again, the marble floor beneath the ancient wolf crest gave a gentle tremor. It was so subtle that the crystal glasses on a nearby table barely whispered against one another. The living darkness drifted away from Evelyn's wrist and flowed toward the center of the hall. One candle ignited, then another, then another. Warm silver light spread across the polished floor, tracing lines that had been hidden inside the marble for centuries. The entire great hall grew silent as the ancient carvings awakened one by one, weaving together into a magnificent circular seal surrounding the old wolf crest. Servants instinctively stepped back. Even the guards lowered their heads without being told. Helena stared at the glowing floor with tears quietly gathering in her eyes. "The Hall of Oaths," she whispered. "I never believed I would see it again." Damien slowly walked toward the edge of the ancient seal, but stopped before stepping inside it. "Only one person may awaken it," he said softly. He looked toward Evelyn, not with expectation, but with complete trust. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before taking a single step forward. The instant her foot touched the center of the glowing circle, silver light rose gently around her like drifting moonlight. It did not surround her alone. It reached toward Damien as well, wrapping around him with the same quiet warmth before joining their shadows together across the marble floor. A deep stillness settled over the hall. Ancient words appeared around the glowing seal, written in a language no one present had spoken for centuries. The servants stared in confusion. The council officials exchanged uncertain glances. Cedric narrowed his eyes, unable to understand a single symbol. Yet Evelyn heard every word as clearly as if someone stood beside her. The promise is never inherited. It is recognized. She spoke the sentence aloud without thinking. The moment the final word left her lips, the unfamiliar symbols transformed into the common language of the kingdom so that everyone in the hall could finally read them. Cedric took one slow step backward. His face had lost all color. For the first time since entering Black Thorn Castle, certainty abandoned him completely. Damien looked at the ancient words before turning toward Evelyn with quiet understanding. The Guardian never needed another ruler, he said. It was waiting for someone who could still hear the promise after everyone else had forgotten how to listen. No one spoke after Damien's words. The ancient seal continued glowing beneath Evelyn's feet, bathing the great hall in a soft silver light that seemed to wash years of fear from the old stone walls. The warmth surrounding her was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was not the thrill of power. It was the quiet comfort of finally standing where she had always been meant to stand. Lord Cedric remained motionless, his pale eyes fixed upon the glowing inscription now visible to everyone in the hall. The certainty that had guided him for decades was slipping away one truth at a time. "No," he said at last, his voice lower than before. "This cannot be what our ancestors intended." Damien turned toward him with calm understanding rather than accusation. "Perhaps our ancestors intended exactly this. We were simply taught to remember the wrong story." Cedric slowly shook his head. "For 20 years I searched every archive the council possessed. Every record spoke of a curse that consumed kings." Helena looked at him with quiet compassion. "Did any of those records tell you who wrote them?" Cedric remained silent. Helena continued. "History survives through those who preserve it. If fear became the storyteller, fear became the history." Before Cedric could answer, the silver light surrounding the ancient seal rose gently into the air. It did not explode or flash. It gathered with graceful patience until it formed the familiar shape of the great white wolf. Every servant instinctively lowered their head. Every guard stood perfectly still. The Guardian's golden eyes moved slowly across the hall before resting first upon Damien, then upon Evelyn. When it finally spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, quiet enough to comfort, powerful enough that no one could doubt. For generations they called me a curse because they forgot the promise I was guarding. The silver mist around the Guardian unfolded into living memories. Evelyn watched the first Alpha King kneel beneath a full moon before the great white wolf. There was no battle, no punishment, and no dark magic. Only a solemn vow freely offered. The young king promised that every ruler after him would place compassion before pride, service before authority, and mercy before fear. The Guardian accepted that promise, binding itself not to a throne, not to blood, but to the vow itself. The memories flowed onward. Some kings honored that promise. Others slowly allowed fear to replace compassion. With each passing generation, the true story faded until people no longer remembered a guardian watching over a promise. They remembered only the lonely shadow that never abandoned the castle. They gave it a different name, the curse. Tears quietly filled Evelyn's eyes. "You never became something else," she whispered. "We only stopped remembering who you were." The Guardian inclined its head gently. "Fear does not create darkness. It teaches people to mistake light they no longer understand." Cedric lowered his gaze. His voice, once filled with certainty, now carried only regret. "I believe that if the Guardian chose me, I could force the kingdom into peace." The great white wolf looked at him without anger. "Peace demanded through control is only another form of fear." Cedric slowly closed his eyes. For the first time in many years, he understood that his greatest mistake had not been ambition. It had been believing that a sacred promise could ever belong to someone who wished to possess it. The guardian then turned toward Damien and Evelyn together. Gentle silver light surrounded them both once again. Damien instinctively stepped closer to Evelyn, placing himself between her and the gathering crowd without even realizing he had done so. She looked up at him, and for the first time since entering Black Thorn Castle, she saw no loneliness reflected in his silver eyes. Only hope. The guardian spoke one final time. One carried compassion when abandoned by the world. One carried faith when abandoned by history. Together, the promise has found its keepers once more. As the final words settled over the great hall, every bell throughout Black Thorn Castle rang together, not to warn the kingdom of danger, but to welcome home a truth that had waited generations to be remembered. The final echoes of the castle bells drifted across the snow-covered valley like a promise carried on the winter wind. No one inside the great hall moved. Every face remained turned toward the great white guardian as its luminous form shimmered beneath the stained glass ceiling. The living shadow that generations had feared no longer appeared mysterious or threatening. It stood revealed exactly as it had always been, faithful to a vow people had forgotten but never truly broken. The guardian's golden eyes rested upon Lord Cedric. There was no anger in its gaze, no desire to condemn the man who had spent half his life pursuing the wrong truth. Only quiet understanding. You search for a keeper, the guardian said gently. But a promise cannot be possessed. It can only be honored. Cedric lowered his head. Years of certainty dissolved into a single moment of painful clarity. He finally understood that every choice he had made had been driven by fear disguised as responsibility. He had believed that only absolute control could protect the kingdom. Instead, he had nearly buried the very promise meant to preserve it. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked to the edge of the ancient seal and knelt. Not before Damien, not before Evelyn, before the forgotten vow that had outlived every misunderstanding surrounding it. Damien watched him in silence before quietly saying, "The kingdom will need people willing to remember, not people pretending they never made mistakes." Cedric lifted his eyes, surprised by the absence of bitterness in the king's voice. For the first time in many years, he bowed not out of duty, but out of genuine humility. The guardian's form began dissolving into thousands of tiny silver lights that floated upward like snowflakes caught in moonlight. Before the last traces disappeared, it looked once more toward Evelyn. "The world convinced you that. Being unwanted meant being without purpose," it said softly. "Yet the heart that expects nothing often protects everything." Evelyn closed her fingers around the small silver pendant Elder Miriam had placed in her hand before she left Frost Hollow. Suddenly she understood why the old woman had waited until that morning to return it. Some gifts only revealed their meaning when the one receiving them was finally ready to understand. She turned toward Damien. For a quiet moment neither of them spoke. Words no longer seemed necessary. Throughout every trial since arriving at Black Thorn Castle, he had never treated her as an offering, a burden, or a solution. He had simply seen her as a person when almost everyone else had stopped looking. Damien offered his hand with the same quiet sincerity that had always guided him. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I hope you choose it freely." Evelyn smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way it never had during the lonely years behind her. She placed her hand in his, not because destiny demanded it, but because trust had quietly grown between them one choice at a time. The moment their hands met, warm sunlight broke through the winter clouds above Black Thorn Castle. Golden light spilled across the ancient hall, and outside, the first green shoots pushed gently through the melting snow, although spring was still weeks away. It was not magic forcing the seasons to change. It was simply the first morning in generations that no longer carried the weight of a forgotten fear. Several weeks later, wolves from every pack gathered beneath the ancient moon tree in Frost Hollow. They expected another ceremony shaped by old traditions. Instead, Damien stood among them without a crown, while Evelyn stood beside him wearing the same silver pendant that had once belonged to her mother. There were no offerings, no decrees from the royal council, only a new promise spoken where the old misunderstanding had begun. No one will ever again be chosen because they are considered disposable, Damien said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. From this day forward, Every life within this kingdom carries equal worth. Elder Miriam quietly closed her eyes, relief softening the sorrow she had carried for so many years. Parents reached for their children's hands. The fear that had shaped generations did not disappear in an instant, but hope had finally become stronger than the story that once ruled them. In the years that followed, travelers told many versions of what had happened at Black Thorn Castle. Some insisted that a rejected Omega had broken an ancient curse. Others claimed that a lonely Alpha King had finally found the one person destined to stand beside him. But those who had witnessed the truth always smiled before gently correcting the tale. They would say there had never been a curse waiting inside the castle. There had only been a promise waiting for two ordinary hearts courageous enough to remember it. And from that day on, whenever children asked why the guardian no longer walked the halls at night, their parents would answer with quiet certainty. Because the promise no longer needed someone to guard it from fear. It was finally safe in people who chose kindness instead. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.